Pause what you're doing, this one's good. After breaking his foot on stage, which legendary rock band's throne did Axl Rose borrow so he could keep touring? And here's another for the curious. Which unusual method did Axl Rose use to decide who could join his band during the making of Chinese Democracy? Think you know it? Type your guess below, I'll tell the answer soon. But before we get to that, welcome to The Versed Music Legends. I'm Dick Carlson, and if you stick around, you'll find out why Axl says he sings in 6 different voices and what those voices really meant. Plus, the surprisingly wholesome ritual that helped calm one of rock's most volatile frontmen. But to truly understand Axl Rose, we need to go back to where it all began, because his early years hold pivotal moments you'll never believe. Lafayette, Indiana in the early 60s wasn't the kind of place that made rock stars. It was modest, devout, and slow-moving, a town where Sunday service was louder than Saturday night. But inside one tiny, tightly wound household, a storm was already forming. Born William Bruce Rose Jr. in 1962, the boy who'd one day scream across stadiums started life silenced in a house where music was banned. Women were deemed evil, and TVs were thrown out for being satanic. His stepfather, strict, violent, and church-obsessed, kept the house locked under religious control, even as Axl secretly fell in love with sound. To listen to Supertramp, he'd have a friend call him on the phone and quietly play the record through the receiver. In a world where rebellion meant tuning into FM radio, that quiet act was everything. It wasn't just music, it was survival. But behind the closed doors of his Pentecostal upbringing, young Axl didn't just survive. He began to rehearse. He sang in church choirs from age 5, alongside his siblings as the Bailey Trio, learning harmonies, projection, and, crucially, how to shift tone, mood, and delivery mid-song. By high school, he was deliberately using multiple voices to confuse his chorus teacher, a technique that, unbelievably, he would still be refining decades later. And it all started here. No money, no spotlight, no instruments of his own, just a battered upright piano, a house full of silence, and a kid with a need to be louder than his past. But when he discovered at 17 that the man he called Dad wasn't his father, something snapped. He dropped the name Bailey, took back Rose, and then, in a final break from the life that caged him, he added one more word to his identity: Axl. It wasn't just a name, it was armor. He fled Lafayette in a beat-up car, dodging minor charges and bad blood, and drove west with nothing but a duffel bag, a cassette case, and a friend named Izzy Stradlin. The road didn't promise stardom, but it did offer one thing he'd never had: control. He hadn't escaped the pain, he'd only learned how to sing through it. By 1987, the kid from Lafayette had turned Los Angeles upside down. Axl Rose wasn't just a frontman, he was a fuse. And when Appetite for Destruction exploded into the best-selling debut album in history, it wasn't just the music that hit hard, it was the lifestyle that followed. Within months, he went from living on friends' couches and surviving off Tower Records wages to buying his first real home, a secluded place in the Hollywood Hills with enough space to scream without apology. The house, wired for late-night sessions and blackout curtains, became both a sanctuary and a fortress. He filled it with rescued animals, dogs, cats, even exotic pets, often pampering them more than himself. Axl wasn't into bling for bling's sake. He was particular. He wore designer boots, but only if they felt right on stage. He collected vintage t-shirts and bandanas, some of which became talismans, items he had to wear to feel right before a show. Cars? Just one, a black Corvette, a reward to himself that he barely drove but polished like it was sacred. But the real indulgence was creative freedom. Early on, he pushed the band to evolve beyond fast riffs and punk sneers. And he didn't just want to sound different, he wanted to feel different. That's when those 6 different voices started showing up. As mentioned earlier, he'd learned to shift tones back in high school chorus just to throw off his teacher. Now, on tracks like Rocket Queen or It's So Easy, you could hear it clearly, growling lows, screeching highs, the full emotional spectrum baked into his range. "I sing in 6 different voices that are all part of me," he'd later say. To most fans, it just sounded wild. To Axl, it was method, each voice like a different mask for a different wound. The band's rise was ferocious, but behind the scenes, relationships were starting to wobble. Even in the afterglow of sold-out arenas, tension simmered. Axl was already working longer in the studio than anyone, staying up all night to dissect vocal takes line by line. The hunger never left, it just got more precise. And as the spotlight grew hotter, the fractures beneath the stage began to widen. By the early 90s, Axl Rose had everything he once dreamed of, and almost none of what he needed. At his peak, he was making millions per tour, millions more in royalties, and controlling a global brand that had become bigger than rock itself. But the louder it all got, the more suffocating it became. He upgraded his home to a sprawling mansion in Malibu, high above the ocean, gated, guarded, and largely empty. Inside, the space was as much bunker as it was palace. Walls lined with soundproofing and blackout drapes, studio rigs wired into the main room so he could track vocals in the middle of the night. He decorated not with platinum records, though there were plenty, but with spiritual artifacts, healing crystals, incense burners, psychic talismans. It wasn't for show, it was armor against the world he no longer trusted. Axl had begun seeing therapists, astrologers, even past-life regressionists. 5 hours a day in therapy before a tour wasn't indulgence, it was survival. His demons weren't quiet, and now that the world was listening, they roared louder than ever. On tour, he demanded black satin sheets and vocal steamers backstage, not as diva quirks but as ritual requirements. If the vibe was off, the show would start late. If a particular bandana didn't feel right, he'd switch it last second. Superstition wasn't a side habit, it was part of the performance architecture. And then there was the moment it all nearly unraveled in 1989 in front of 70,000 fans at the Coliseum. Opening for the Rolling Stones, Axl abruptly stopped mid-set and announced it would be the band's final show unless his bandmates got clean. The world called it a tantrum. But the truth, rarely acknowledged, was that Axl was watching his chosen family collapse from addiction. That mic drop ultimatum wasn't rage, it was heartbreak. Offstage, the heartbreak didn't let up. He lost an unborn child. A marriage fell apart. Close friends died. The rage became more erratic, but the reason behind it was almost always the same: fear of losing control over what mattered most. And that fear of unraveling, of betrayal, of collapse, became the foundation of a new obsession. When everything he built came crashing down, he didn't vanish. He buried himself in the music. When the spotlight faded and the band fell apart, Axl didn't stage a dramatic exit. He simply disappeared. For nearly a decade, the man who once prowled arenas retreated to a fortress in Malibu. The ocean-facing estate turned into a creative bunker. Inside, time bent around him. Studio cables ran through living spaces. Bedrooms became vocal booths. Days turned into nights, and songs became rituals. Chinese Democracy wasn't just an album, it was a test of endurance, obsession, and control. The sessions became legend. Thousands of hours, millions of dollars, hundreds of abandoned takes. It wasn't unusual for Axl to track vocals one line at a time or to rehearse guitar riffs that never made it into the final mix. Each sound had to feel right, not just sound right. And when it came to building his new band, the process wasn't just about talent, it was about energy. Which unusual method did he use to decide who could join his band? Did you guess? Well, the truth is, he had a psychic read their aura first. Seriously, photographs were sent to a spiritual advisor who would judge each person's energy signature before they ever picked up an instrument. If it didn't align with Axl's instincts, they were gone. Some were never even called back. It wasn't sabotage, it was faith. In a world where trust had shattered, this was how he tried to rebuild it. But the real evolution wasn't just external. As mentioned earlier, the 6 different voices he'd toyed with as a teenager, mocking his high school choir teacher, became core to his identity. Axl now used those voices with surgical precision: a snarling rasp for defiance, a low, cracked register for grief, a falsetto for moments of longing. They weren't just vocal tricks, they were emotional masks. He lived by a schedule no one else followed. Axl time was now an operating philosophy. He read spiritual books, watched cartoons on VHS, pampered his dogs, and played PC games deep into the night. This wasn't a rock star spiraling. It was a man rebuilding himself through sound, silence, and space. The mansion on the cliff became a monastery of obsession, and after nearly 2 decades, the album came out. But the real victory wasn't the release, it was that he finished anything at all. He gave up everything to finish the record, but what he rebuilt was bigger than any album. Today, Axl Rose lives in quieter orbit, still passionate, still particular, but no longer the center of chaos. He tours with a reunited Guns N' Roses that now feels more like a brotherhood than a battlefield. The mansion in Malibu remains his base, but these days he's more likely to be found texting old friends than shouting at headlines. In 2016, during the band's monumental reunion run, Axl broke his foot just 2 shows in. So, which legendary rock band's throne did Axl Rose borrow to keep the tour alive? Dave Grohl's. That's right, the Foo Fighters frontman loaned him the custom-built throne he'd used after his own leg injury. And instead of postponing, Axl sat in that throne, leg in a cast, and blasted through a global tour, including a stint fronting AC/DC. The man once infamous for keeping 20,000 people waiting was now too dedicated to stop. And when the show ended, he'd head back to the bus and wind down with old VHS tapes of Looney Tunes and The Little Mermaid. You'd never have guessed those were the kinds of videos Axl Rose watched to relax on tour buses. But that's it. The guy who screamed through Welcome to the Jungle was soothed by cartoons. It's not irony, it's balance. He still trains vocally, still micromanages set lists, still brings his dogs on tour. His fortune is estimated at $200 million, but it's not the money he guards. It's the routine, the silence, the peace. And when Lisa Marie Presley died in 2023, Axl didn't just send flowers. He performed November Rain at her memorial service. Just him, a piano, and the echoes of a life that, like his own, was misunderstood. He isn't chasing the crown anymore. He's wearing the scars. And when he steps on stage now, it isn't for approval. It's to finish what he started, on his own time, in his own way. What part of Axl's story hit you hardest, and what still doesn't sit right? Let us know in the comments. If you felt this one, there's more where that came from. Hit subscribe and check out the next legend on screen, someone else who turned pain into power and paid for every note.